If you look across, again, the 20th century, there are many technological innovations that occurred. Mass production techniques. Electricity was infused in business in various kinds of ways. By and large, technological change tended to benefit unskilled workers as much as skilled workers. Think about assembly line work, for example. What's happened in the last 30 years is that technological change has favored high-skilled workers much more than low-skilled workers. It's a real change that's happened. Other things have been going on. The fraction of unionization in the economy has dropped in half. The real value of the minimum wage has fallen. Immigration has increased, which increases the competition for low-skilled jobs. But the really big factor is that technological change, globalization, have really changed the nature of rewards to the labor force in terms of skill levels, and they've changed the demand for different kinds of skills. So, an example. If you go back to the Department of Labor's Occupational Outlook Handbook and read the definition of secretaries. Secretaries relieve their employers of routine duties so they can work on more important matters. What about 2001? Office automation and organizational restructuring have led secretaries to assume a wide range of new responsibilities once reserved for managerial and professional staff. Many secretaries now provide training and orientation to new staff, conduct research on the internet, and learn to operate new office technologies. Right? You can see that the occupation of secretary has been upgraded substantially in terms of the skills that are required. And you can think that the kind of skills that secretaries of the past could use very effectively in their jobs just aren't enough for secretarial jobs today. Same thing with a lot of machine operators. It takes much more skill, you have to do some math to be able to operate complex machines. So the skill requirements have changed a lot. And it's very important to realize that in a way the game has changed very fundamentally. I think some people wish if only we could go back to the old days where schools stressed the fundamentals, and if we could somehow convey those skills that we were able to convey 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we'd be just fine. That's not true. The skills that we need are much more substantial than used to be the case. And the kind of skill level that kids need to come out of school with in order to get a middle-class job, forget about a professional and managerial job, those skills have increased a lot. So other countries have figured out a way to provide these higher levels of education. We're falling behind, and the United States hasn't been able to keep up. So this kind of restructuring that's taken place has just produced fundamental changes in the occupational distribution. So this is just comparing where the jobs were in 1979 versus 2009. Back in 1979, a third of the labor force was blue collar. 2009, 20%. The jobs have just disappeared. Administrative support. Insurance companies used to have armies of clerks filing paper in the back office. All those jobs are gone. So job categories like administrative support have been reduced a lot. In contrast, professional administration, managerial jobs, they've increased a lot. Some low-skilled jobs have increased, service jobs, food service workers, hospital workers, nursing home attendants. But by and large, it's the kind of higher skill jobs that have really increased as technological change has demanded that they increase. So that's the fundamental force behind why income inequality has increased so much. It's not because Ronald Reagan caused a recession that was so bad for blue-collar workers. It's not the politics, it's not the policy, it's this fundamental change in the kind of skill requirements and globalization that have really swept across all developed countries. So we've got income inequality increasing, and we've got the gap between high and low income kids' schooling and test scores increasing apace. So what are the linkages here? Why is it that income inequality here is linking to growing gaps in terms of kids' test scores and educational attainments? The book, I hate to think that 26 chapters reduces to such a simple diagram, but it does. And we've investigated a lot of possible explanations that didn't work out. But the story, told in a simple way, seems to be in two-part. One is what income inequality has done to family income and what changes in families because family income inequality has increased, has translated into increasing gaps for kids. And another part of the story is what income inequality has done to kids' attainments through schools. To what extent have processes involving schools been affected by increasing income inequality, and how has that changed for the detriment of low-income kids? So the family income story is really a two-part one. One is kind of the obvious one. The gap between high and low-income families has changed a lot, and high-income families can afford more relative to low-income families. It used to be the case. They can spend more money, and that's part of the story. When families can spend more money on kids, the kids do better. There's also part of the story that involves how low-income families are affected by the kind of relentless pressure of living in a low-income kind of environment, how that can affect mental health, how that can affect parenting, and how that in turn can affect how kids turn out. But let me talk first about this, this top story about what money can buy. One of the chapters in the book goes back and digs up information from consumer expenditure surveys, where the US government tracks what families are spending their money on. And they've done this all the way back to 1972. And if you look back to the 1972-1973 Consumer Expenditure Survey, and again, divide the families into families in the bottom 20% versus the top 20%, what you see is when you tally up the kind of expenditures that families were making on a set of categories that might be called child enrichment. It's things like what they spend on childcare, what they spend for private school tuition if they send their kids to private school, what they spend on computers, what they spend on vacations, what they spend on books, an assortment of categories that might conceivably help kids in terms of their school readiness, and once kids get into school, help them keep up. So, of course, high-income families are going to be spending more than low-income families. The gap is the difference between about $3,500 for high-income families and $840 or so for low-income families. Again, these are all in today's dollars. So let's fast forward now to just about 5 years ago. Low-income families are indeed spending more on behalf of their children with these child enrichment expenditures, but the increase has been pretty modest, from about $800 to $1,300. Up at the top of the income distribution, you're getting this enormous increase in the amount of money that high-income families are spending on their kids. It's gone from about $3,500 to almost $8,000 to $9,000. All right, so again, the gap, we saw a growing gap in income. It's not so surprising we're seeing a growing gap in how much of that income is being spent on behalf of kids. And we know that income isn't everything, but from very careful studies, we know that income is an active ingredient for improving how well kids are doing in terms of school readiness and in terms of once they get into school. It also shows up when families have to make decisions about how much higher education their kids can afford. Do they send their kids to community colleges? Can they send them to four-year colleges? Income matters a lot, and it matters increasingly for those kinds of things. So an important part of the story of income inequality is what money can buy, and we're seeing these big differences in that. The other part of the story that I won't talk very much about is this emerging evidence showing how detrimental low-income life can be for mental health and stress of mothers and parenting in turn. There's a very interesting study that looks in the 1990s. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a big program that was actually started under Ronald Reagan and expanded very significantly in the 1990s by Bill Clinton. And a number of studies have taken this increase in the 1990s, and they've tried to see, would families that were in line to get quite an increase because of the policy change, how are their kids doing in terms of achievement? How are the moms doing in terms of mental health? You're getting both the achievement studies showing that money does seem to buy increases in test scores, but you're also getting this really interesting evidence showing that mothers who were in a position who were most stood to benefit most from the increase in their income tax credit were reporting reductions in mental health. There were mental problems. There were increases in mental health, and there were even biomarkers gathered, so you could test for stress-related biomarkers in the blood, and those decreased as well. So income does indeed seem to matter in terms of parental stress levels in parenting. So that's the family story. All right? So let's talk about the school story next. How is it that family income inequality might be affecting kids as it affects schools? So the book has quite a number of chapters on putting this story together. And it's a little bit involved, but bear with me again. It's not like a spaghetti diagram. It's a little bit easier to follow. One of the things that happened with the rise in income inequality that turned out to be driving a lot of what's going on is that residential segregation by income increased substantially, especially in the 1980s and early 1990s. Right? Residential segregation by race has declined somewhat over the last 30 years. Residential segregation by income, in contrast, has increased. So poor kids are much more likely to be, they've always been more likely to have poor neighbors, but even more so now relative to 40 years ago. Rich kids have always been more likely to have rich neighbors, but even more so now, right, relative to 40 years ago. And the fact that kids tend to attend schools that are neighborhood schools, by and large, means that this residential income segregation translates into school segregation by income, right? So low-income kids in schools are more likely to have low-income classmates now relative to 30 or 40 years ago. High-income students are much more likely to have high-income classmates now relative to 30 or 40 years ago. So what does that mean? What does it mean that poverty has become more concentrated in schools? Well, it means several different things. One is the kind of potential problems that having more poor classmates might cause. If you look at high and low income schools and see the concentration of achievement problems, for example, in high and low income schools, what you see is that about 40% of low income schools, 40% of the kids attending low income schools could be classified as having achievement problems. It's only 10% for high income schools. If you, again, these are national data. If you look at teacher reports of kids' ability to engage in school, to pay attention during school, if you look at problems there, about a third of low-income schools have students. The students attending low-income schools, a third of them could be in this attention problem category, compared to about 17% for high income. And then behavior problems as well. So kids attending low-income schools are surrounded by lower achieving classmates and less attentive classmates. And that makes it harder to teach, and it makes it harder to learn.